well, I think I'm going to get started because obviously you guys are on time and I don't want to make you wait. So what I'm going to do is share my screen now with a presentation that we have. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that are important to know about the Office of Accessible Education. So my name is Cara Cadavera. I am the Associate Director of the Office of Accessible Education. And as I mentioned, Heather Steffen, the Accommodations Coordinator, should be joining in a few minutes to answer any questions you may have. So the purpose of our, let me move this over really quickly. The purpose of our department is to ensure that students are receiving accommodations on the SU campus. We provide accommodations using the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So in a few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about how high school accommodations are a bit different than college accommodations. And the main reason for that is that we're governed by slightly different laws. So let's talk a little bit about applying for services. The first thing you want to do in order to apply to services is go to our website. So let me click on that so that you can see that page. What you want to do when you log into the website is click on Register with OAE. That will take you to the step-by-step instructions of kind of the process that we go through in order to make sure that your documentation is reviewed in a timely manner and that we're communicating with you about next steps. So that's the first place that you're going to want to go when accessing our website. It is important when you log on there to have an idea of the accommodations you received in the past and any accommodations that you're hoping to receive at SCU so that we can take a look at that and make some comparisons along with the the documentation that you provide. And most of the time that happens within about 14 business days. And that's a pretty long time, but the reason for that is when students are applying for our program in March, April, May, we get a lot of applications, as you can imagine. And so it takes us a bit of time to process through all that documentation. Some of you may be aware, evaluations, psychological, psychoeducational evaluations can be up to 30 pages long. So we really want to make sure that we understand every detail of that documentation when it's coming in so that when we have a conversation with you about your accommodations, we really have a good full picture of everything that you've experienced and that evaluation. When we finish reviewing the documentation, we'll send you an email and that will reach out to you for next steps that we need to do. Next steps may be your documentation is great. We're ready to have a meeting with you and talk about the accommodations that have been approved for you. Next steps might also be maybe your documentation isn't quite sufficient and we are looking to get some more information from you about how you deal with your disability so that we can determine the most appropriate accommodations for you. So when we send that letter, or I'm sorry, when we send that email, we want to meet with you. And so what's going to happen is you meet with either me or the director, Maud, and the appointment is about 45 minutes. We cover an overview of all of our services and the procedures, the expected responsibilities, and we talk in a lot of detail about the accommodations that you've received in the past and the accommodations that you will be receiving at SCU. Accommodations aren't always one-for-one, meaning the accommodations you had in high school aren't always appropriate in the college setting. And the reason for that is we don't provide any accommodations that would fundamentally alter the nature of the class. So we're really particular about that. And so accommodations in the high school setting are meant for a different purpose. And I'll share that in a few minutes when we're doing a side-by-side comparison of what the accommodations are. So just to recap, you apply at our website, uploading your documentation, and I'll talk about what documentation is appropriate on the next slide. Then we are going to review the documentation that you provided, and it takes about 14 business days in our really busiest time of year. Once we calm down and things are a little bit more standard throughout the regular quarter, it only takes about 5 to 7 days. And so if there's ever a need for re-reviewing your documentation to determine if there's additional accommodations that may be warranted, then it would take about 5 to 7 days after that initial review period. Then we contact you for next steps, and you come and you meet with an OAE counselor. Right now, we're doing all of our intake appointments in the online setting via Zoom. And we find that this is just as effective as when we meet with students in person, sometimes more effective, because we can really do a demonstration of every step-by-step of the portal, which is what you'll be using throughout the time that you are at SCU to request your accommodations. And please keep in mind that all of the documentation that's provided is confidential, so we don't share that with anybody else on campus. That is just for me and our office to review the accommodations and the deficits that may be had and the diagnosis, so that we can establish appropriate accommodations. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the documentation guidelines. These are listed on our website, so I'm going to click over here. And you can see they're broken down by category. There's a lot of things under this that we like to see in documentation. And I will be honest, most of the time, not every one of these points are included in the documentation, but that's where the interactive interview comes in, and where we may not see something in documentation. That's where, when we have a conversation with you, we can sort of pull out the information that we need to establish a very individualized accommodation plan for you. So I would encourage you to look. Well, let's start recording from here. So the question is, so you wouldn't necessarily work with the same counselor, because really the counselors is me and the director Maud. And so you're always welcome to ask questions to us. But Heather, who is also here, she's our accommodations coordinator. She has a wealth of information, as well as Patty, our administrative assistant. She's always able to answer many questions that students have. So I would like to say that we kind of collaborate in working with students, but if a student feels really comfortable working with one particular person, they're always welcome to continue working with that person too. All right, the next question is speaking about housing with regards to special needs. So that's a great question. We handle that similarly to how we handle every other accommodation. And what that means is that we receive documentation indicating what the student is asking for and how the student doesn't have access to their housing as a result of their disability. So they're not able to enjoy the full environment that they're living in because of their disability. And there's certain accommodations that may be established that would allow the student to more fully enjoy and fully benefit from the housing on campus. So I know that's a little cryptic. It's kind of difficult to explain if you're not actually talking about a specific situation. So in terms of single room housing, so that is an accommodation that can happen. There's also accommodations related to the bathroom or related to shower facilities or different things like that. So what I would say is submit an application, submit documentation, notate in the box at the bottom of the application what you're looking for, and we're happy to review all of that. I will say 90% of the time, we need more information when establishing housing accommodations. So what we do is we reach out to the student, we say, let's have a meeting and let's talk a little bit more about what you're requesting and how we can support you. And from there, we determine whether or not that housing accommodation is supported with the documentation. Once we approve a housing accommodation, that's really where our involvement ends. We give that information to housing, and they are the ones that make the determination on placement. And so, for instance, I would inform housing that a certain student received single room housing. Now that student is basically going to work with housing from that point to determine what residence hall would be the most appropriate for that student in that situation. All right. So please, if I don't answer your questions fully, feel free to do a follow-up question in the chat. I'm happy to answer anything more. So the next question is there a place to direct students who need organizational or other types of more specific academic support? That's a great question. There's a lot of different organizations on campus who are there to support students. For instance, we have the Drama and Tutoring Center. We often are referring students to tutoring to their advisors, to the English Learning Center for them to be able to get support with writing. So really what most of the time we refer students out because there's so many great resources on campus. However, if there's basic work that we could do with a student for organizational skills, we're happy to do that. But sometimes the support that we can provide is not enough for students because it can be really difficult to organize 4 different classes or 5 different classes, especially in the online setting. And so what we often do with students who have more severe difficulty with organizational skills is refer them out to an executive functioning coach, because those people are going to be the best at really pinpointing what the difficulty is and identifying specific strategies to be able to address that. So again, we're able to do very basic informational sessions about organizational skills, but I would really recommend working with an executive functioning coach for more intensive work with that. All right. So we are in 2021 now, so you'd likely be applying for 21-22. I would say a 9th grade evaluation, 2017-18 is probably sufficient. You're right on that cusp of where it might not have been normed on adults. However, we've let some of that stuff go along with the conversation that we have with the students, the interactive interview. And so once we have that conversation with you, if we feel like that documentation is sufficient, then we're good to go. I can't answer 100% without actually seeing it, but I would say that we tend to lean towards accepting that documentation. What I do want to emphasize though is if there's any goal of going to graduate school, law school, taking the GRE, it is important for you to have a more recent evaluation. And so even if you don't have it in high school, you may consider getting an additional evaluation when you're a sophomore or junior at SCU, because that will give you the most information and the best information about how your learning needs have changed over time, and will allow us to more appropriately recommend accommodations to those different entities when you're taking those exams. Any other questions? I hope this recorded. I'm a little worried that it didn't record. So we definitely still have some time. So if you have anything else you can think of, I'm happy to answer anything. And then if you have any other, Heather's been in our office longer than I have, and so she does have a lot of information, some things that I may not have answered. So if you have anything you'd like to add, Heather, I'm happy to turn it over to you.
No, I mean, it sounded like you really covered everything. From what I've been able to see at Santa Clara, I say that I've been there for a long time. So what I've seen at Santa Clara is that, you know, there's a lot of resources for students. And the biggest piece is the students really need to seek it out or ask the questions of, this is where I'm struggling, what can you help me with? And everybody's there to really try to get these students to be as successful as they possibly can. So I do encourage everybody, use our office as a resource. Even if it's not in our office where it's housed, we certainly will do some research and outreach to find the best location to make sure that you're fully supported.
Absolutely. I do find that our office sometimes becomes kind of like a centralized place where students are coming because they're just not really sure where they need to go to ask questions. So they come to us and then we refer them out to where they need to go. So, but I think a lot of offices on SU campus turn out that way. So wherever the student tends to go, we're all pretty good about directing you in other places if there's a better office to answer that question. Anything else you can think of? Well, I'm happy to stick around a little bit if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask me. But if you feel like your questions have been answered, you know, you feel welcome to leave. I did put the contact information for our office. The OAE at scu.edu was in the PowerPoint. So, you know, please contact us if you need to reach out to us. Thank you guys.
Hi, I have one question.
Yeah,
My Wi-Fi like cut out, so I missed part of the presentation. And I
okay.
think you talked about how you were going to go over the difference between high school and college accommodations. And I'm pretty sure I missed that part. Could you go over that again?
Absolutely. I will definitely do that. Let me go back a little bit. All right, let's see. I think I might need to share my screen again. All right. Okay. So the K through 12 accommodations, the goal is really to ensure success at school. So the goal is really to move a student through the educational system, all the way K through 12 to graduation. The school is the one who identifies the student with the disability. So maybe the teachers recognize that a student might be struggling and they refer them out for evaluations. And oftentimes the school is the one responsible for paying for and providing those evaluations for students. And the school's IEP team or the 504 team, they're the ones who communicate the accommodation needs to the instructors and make sure that they're being implemented. So the way that the university accommodations are different is that our goal is to ensure access. So we want to make sure that all students, regardless of whether or not there's a disability, are on the same playing field. So there's no deficits that exist, and the accommodations are meant to remove those deficits. And the student has to identify with our office. So you have to let us know if you are a student with a disability who needs accommodation so that we can do the appropriate review and make sure that we're establishing the accommodations that meet your needs. You are the one responsible for providing documentation. So if your documentation, if for whatever reason is not sufficient and we ask you to get additional documentation, we're not the ones that are paying for that. Unfortunately, you have to pay for that, whereas in high school, a lot of times they're able to support that process. And then students have to communicate with OAE and instructors about accommodations. And so what that means is that we will inform, once you request your accommodations, we'll inform your instructors that you receive accommodations. But that's where the limit, that's where it kind of ends. If instructors ask us questions, we're happy to answer any questions they may have. But we're not outwardly, reaching out to instructors to explain every detail for each accommodation letter. But what I would encourage students to do is to have that conversation with their instructors to make sure that both of you are on the same page in terms of what it's going to take to implement these accommodations and that you both understand what is necessary. And then lastly, the student is responsible for letting us know if accommodations are not being implemented. So if, for instance, you're not receiving your extra time for testing, or the instructor's not recording their audio for their classes right now, then you'd need to let us know so that we can reach out to the instructor and make sure that they understand that these are legally required accommodations, and we can help them sort of troubleshoot if they're not sure how to implement them. So I hope that answers your question. Were you able to come back for students' responsibility?
I don't remember.
Okay, well, let's talk about that really quickly too then, because we
Okay.
have a little extra time. And so when a student comes into our office, is at SCU, it is your responsibility to request accommodations through the portal each quarter. And part of that intake meeting that we have is demonstrating how to do that. So it's a really easy process for you. You'll need to communicate your need for accommodations with all of your instructors, as I just mentioned, and do that after you request your accommodations. I always encourage students to follow up with an email outlining what was discussed. That's helpful for you to remember what your instructor asks you to do to make sure your accommodations are being implemented. It's a good way for you to review that information, and the instructor, if you send it to the instructor, then they can always refer back to it too. If you're ever having difficulty in implementing your accommodations, you would reach out to our office, and we're happy to step in and support that process at any point. If your symptoms change or you feel like you're struggling, you need more accommodations, but you're not sure what to ask for, we are always reviewing documentation. So you're welcome to reach out to our office, tell us what you're dealing with so that we can determine if the documentation on file is sufficient for reviewing your new accommodation request, or if we may need to request additional documentation from you at that point. I also mentioned that we often will establish temporary accommodations or provisional accommodations for a short term to allow you sufficient time to get supporting documentation if we feel like at that point that we can see where you're experiencing some difficulty, but it would be more supported if we got additional documentation. And then lastly, of course, contact us if you have any questions about your current accommodations, again, or if you feel like you need additional accommodations. And then of course, our email in case you have any questions related to anything that we've talked about today or anything else you can think of after the presentation.
Thank you.
Absolutely, no problem. Any questions you have?
I don't have any right now, but I'll follow up with the email if I think of anything.
Sounds good. Thank you
Thank you.
guys.